Hello, welcome to Conscious TV. My name is Iain McNay, and today our guest is Gangaji. Hi, Gangaji.
Hi.
And I'm just remembering that I first heard about you several years ago. There's a friend of mine called Tosho. He's dead now. He died of cancer several years ago. And he told me something very significant happened just in a meeting with you. It wasn't even at a meeting. It was just meeting you. And what happened was that he'd heard about you, and he was going to a satsang you were holding in Maui, Hawaii, and it was pouring with rain. And he was a little confused. He wasn't sure where to go, and he stopped this car to ask directions, and the window wound down. Actually, it was probably electric, wasn't it? He probably pushed a button, and it was you. And he was so taken aback, he just started laughing in the rain. And literally, something changed in his life, and he was never the same again. It's just, and I think the words he used were something like, the background became the foreground, and the foreground became the background. And so, are you aware you have a catalytic function somehow? Is that?
Well, it's certainly nothing I do, so I'm not aware of it in the sense of a power and I'm doing something. But I did have a similar experience with my teacher when he opened the door when I first met him in Hardwar, and he said, "Welcome, come in." And there was just this hugeness and this presence. I did know about him, and I knew I was going to meet what hopefully was my real final teacher. But I saw him, and there was such a welcome in his eyes that I just started laughing, and I recognized this is it. This is where I'm supposed to be. And when I would question him about that, he said, "Well, that's the mystery. You are supposed to be here, and neither one of us is in charge of that." And so it's some kind of synchronistic moment of coming together. When you tell that story, I can remember that because it's rare that somebody starts to ask you for directions and then just burst wide open.
Right.
So I would say it was coming from him. It was a thrilling meeting. It went back and forth.
Yeah. It was interesting because I kind of lost contact with him. I used to see him socially, and then he had cancer and was very sick, obviously dying, and he was in a hospice. And apparently, I didn't visit him. I wasn't so close to him then. But what happened in the hospice was that he, obviously, you know you're going to die. Other people know they're going to die. The nurses know you're going to die. And he kept saying to the other guys there, "Isn't this exciting? We're all going to die. I wonder what happens next." And I just thought, that touched me. I just thought that was brilliant.
Beautiful. What an attitude.
Yeah.
It's curiosity. You know, it's the willingness to not know and to be conscious in that. It's a death that's like that is a gift to everybody who's present. And really, as you were telling me about him, it seems like his life was like that. This openness then. You mentioned that the background shifted to the foreground, and the way I hear that is that what we're usually protecting is then in front of the protection, and we can be who we are. And we are, even just as human beings, naturally curious creatures. And we build up places we aren't supposed to go or aren't supposed to look into, and we suffer from that. And so this willingness to look into death, well, that's a willingness for the ultimate curiosity and openness.
In a way, I guess it is. I haven't thought about this myself a lot, but I guess that's, you don't really know. People say, well, different religions say different things happen, and there could be past lives, or there could be future lives, but we don't really know, do we?
It sounds like those are mostly comfort stories to me, as a way of not having to face death. So I find it really useful to ask people, at least temporarily, to put all of those stories aside and to assume that in that moment of death, everything you think you are is no longer existing. It's over, it's finished. So you as you think you are, you as you experience yourself, perceptions and your memories, your history, your attainments, it's finished. And in that then there's a possibility of meeting oneself as nothing, as no thing. And that's freedom. really, because everything that we are burdened by is some kind of attachment to who we are. I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm enlightened, I'm unenlightened, uh, I'm famous, I'm not famous, I made it, I haven't made it. In death, it's all over. You're nothing. And that's free.
It
So
is.
that was
Yeah.
that moment
Yeah.
for Tasha, I think, when
Yeah.
the window rolled down. It's like there was just freedom. There's nothing happening.
Yeah.
And that becomes the foreground
Yeah.
of the life.
So let's just spin back a little bit to when you were young. I know you had certain experiences that really impacted you at the time, were important for you. Can we just talk about some of the significant ones?
Well, most of them were not very pleasant experiences, and it's only really in retrospect that I can see that they were important in forming some deep spiritual search for me. Uh, my parents were both alcoholic, and so I was basically taken care of but neglected as a child, and maybe hypersensitive, and I started having very weird experiences when I was about 6, where my body would start to disappear. But it was not blissful disappearance.
Yes. Yeah.
It was horrific.
Yeah.
I was becoming non-existent. Things would
Yeah.
get very big, and then they would get small, and then I would disappear. And I ran to my mother, and she had no idea what I was talking about. And so I ended up going to a psychiatrist, 6 years old, and he showed me some ink blots and gave me some phenobarbital. So
Right.
every time this started to happen to me, I would take a phenobarbital,
Yeah.
and I would say it was a nervous disorder. It was something. It wasn't satori or enlightenment coming. It was deep stress from a little hypersensitive child, and so I took these barbiturates,
Yeah.
little particle of a barbiturate, to calm myself down. And it wasn't until I was 18, 19, or 20, and I first began to meditate, that I decided no more of that. Let's see what this is.
Yeah.
And sure enough, in the first long meditation I ever did, say an hour meditation, it started to happen again. And rather than escape it with medication or just jumping up and getting a glass of water, I just sat with it. And it was actually beautiful then. It was peaceful.
But it takes courage to sit with it, doesn't it?
It took courage for me because
Yeah.
I didn't have any support to sit for it. It was a pathology, and
Yeah.
so it needed to be fixed or healed. And I can't even say why at that moment there was a decision. Well, I didn't like the fact of having to take a little pill when something
Yeah.
started happening. It wasn't happening that often, 2 or 3 times a year, but it was just a revelation to me that actually I had the experience that now I can see. I had the experience that if you're willing to just open to what is arising, just to suspend judgment for a moment, or evaluation, this should be happening or shouldn't be happening, and just be with it fully and completely, then it's beautiful. And I think this is true of people dying, and I think it's true of people who have fear arising in their lives, and it was certainly true for me in this. And it did shift my life. It didn't make me happy. There were many other things that had to occur, but it gave me some inner courage to actually live life with a little more direct curiosity and adventure.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're triggering memories for me, because I had similar experiences when I was a teenager. Just this, I felt I had no body, and I'd be walking along the street, and I felt I was just going to fall down because there was nothing to support me. And I'd forgotten this, that actually I got barbiturates as well
Really?
from the doctor. Yeah, and when I took them, it relaxed me. And then I think I was still living at home then, and my mother hid the bottle and didn't. There was never a discussion about why I had them, and that support structure went. I went to get some more from the doctor, but it's that. And then what I discovered several years later was very interesting, and it took me a long time to integrate this, insofar as what that experience was in a way a very, very deep experience, but it was my fear of the experience.
Yeah.
That was the problem. It wasn't the experience. And like you, in meditation and later in my experience in life, it would come up frequently. It frequently still does, but it doesn't frighten me anymore. And that's the thing that it seems that we get these experiences that are very deep, and it's not knowing what they are, not knowing how to handle them, not knowing how to integrate them, that is the problem for many of us.
No support. There's no one to tell you this is fine. Just relax. Just stay with this. You know, it actually freaked everyone out around me.
Yes.
Let's get her to an authority who can fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful.
It's as if whatever we call it, being true nature, it's creeping through all the time, you
That's
know, and
right.
giving us little signs. And it's and the fortunate thing is these days is you can find out so quickly what the possibilities are through the internet and so many more books that are available. But when we were young, that wasn't there, that information.
No, it was almost forbidden, especially if it seemed like it was mental illness. It was really
Yes.
horrible. And I would say that if I look back on it as a spiritual experience, it was evoked by stress. And I think that often happens, that there's some shock that happens in a person's life, whether it's near death or losing someone or even war. There's a shock that happens that for a moment just tears away our concepts of reality and reveals reality, which is this invisible force that is living this body but doesn't need this body for its existence.
So explain that more. It lives this reality but doesn't need the body.
Well, it's here regardless of the body. Life exists, and then life forms appear in life, you and me and all life forms. But when these life forms die, life still is. So I don't make the equation of life and death. It's more birth and death. And birth and death occur in life. And life is present before birth, present after death. I wouldn't say you as this form is present after death. That's gone. That's finished. But life, the animation of this form is present. And when you recognize that's who I am, and you're recognizing it through a human brain, through human perception, but there's a recognition that's deeper than that. So when the human brain is gone back to dust and this intellect is no longer, there's still life, and that's who I am. I won't know myself as this one, but I now know myself as life. And there's such a profound relaxation in that, for one thing. And also the joy of that the truth of who I am is not dependent on this form. Because we know our forms are doomed to extinction.
Unfortunately, they are.
They are. And maybe it's fortunate.
Yeah.
Because there's a way then of appreciating the preciousness of this human capacity to reflect on what's deeper even than the human. And that's extraordinary. And I believe that we as humans are at an extraordinary time where we can individually, essentially individually and collectively, reflect on what is the source of all life form. And then we see how we are. It's the same source. It is life. And that's deeper than connection. That's oneself, one source.
It's like the reference point changes. There's a realization. It's not really the reference point changes. It's the realization. The reference point is not Iain. It's not Gangaji.
Yeah.
The reference point is consciousness or
That's right.
being, whatever we call it.
And then that's what we start to see in each other. You know, we see features of differences or likenesses, but we see deeper into that. And perhaps that's what Tosh saw when the window was unrolled. There was a moment of just life seeing life, consciousness, seeing consciousness. And you are seen, and you see in the same instant.
There's something that I'm still kind of digesting myself, and this is, I have a fairly deep understanding and experiential to a degree as well about the never changing and the always changing, the never changing and the always changing. And I'm also aware there's something that's very me-ness. It's not personality based. It's just something that is me, as is something you and something Krishna and everybody else. And that's obviously part of the ever-changing, but it also seems very substantive. Some doesn't necessarily feel permanent, but it feels very real. And I'm just interested how you see that in terms of that being expression of being.
Well, I would call that the essence, maybe.
Personal essence.
Essence,
maybe.
or the soul,
Yeah,
we could call it.
okay.
If we're speaking in those
Yeah.
languages, it's the distillation of the personality, maybe, or flares that come from that. And personality can be changed, but that's something relative to this form. It's changeless.
Yes.
But then relative to change itself, it too returns to life itself. But soul, I believe, is a very good designation for that, because you know that in yourself is something, I assume, when you're speaking of that, it feels like is something that is innocent and pure and solid and true. And there's a refuge in that, and a return to that, and that in itself, when it investigates itself, discovers it's the same as the changeless. And that's really where the non-duality comes in, because it is so important to discover what changes, and in that to discover what is changeless. But finally we have to discover they are of the same substance, that it's consciousness in form, changing form, and consciousness in emptiness. It's the same. It's the Heart Sutra, Prajnaparamita Sutra. Emptiness is form,
Right.
empty. And to realize that, then there's this recognition that I am life, and I am also this particular life, that it's not separate. So the I then is both huge and it's very small, microscopic, and over in a brief moment.
You talk a lot in your book, you use the word story a lot, which I like because that's something that's easily identifiable. If we think of story, we usually think of a novel. And in a way, it is a kind of novel, right?
It is fiction.
And are you kind of, when I say you, I mean Gangaji. I have to call you
This
you.
one.
Yes, this one's sitting there, sitting in front of me here. Are you always aware of whether the story tries to kick in, or are there sometimes still that you think maybe 2 minutes past, you think, oh, that's interesting, the story was back and got me for 2 minutes?
Well, there's a story, there's stories. There's the world story, there's the national story, there's the female story, there's the Gangaji story, and my particular Enneagram fixation story. So there are multiple stories happening, and they come and go. But what I'm aware of is the awareness that's holding them. So I don't have a problem with stories. I'm often speaking to people because their stories are the problem, and so I'm inviting people to disidentify with the story. But it doesn't even mean a permanent disidentification. If you're willing to disidentify for a minute, an hour, afternoon, then there's a recognition, I exist without my story. and that's free. I don't need my story to be better or different, or to be the star, to be free, to be fulfilled. And then the story, it seems to me, it's just part of the genetic structure almost, as well as the conditioning, or even what I've eaten for breakfast. It just is, it's a phenomena that appears and disappears. So there are definitely stories going through here. I mean, on my way to the airport, there'll be a Heathrow story that'll arise in that. And that's part of the enjoyment of being a human being in a conscious life form.
But the freedom is, I guess, the consciousness watching the story.
Yes.
That's how it...
Watching it and yet not separate from it.
That's interesting. Watching it, but it's still all one. Yes.
Yes, that's because that for me was essential. When I first began meditating and hearing about the witness consciousness and watching, I really, this is important, I believe, an important stage, separated myself and watched, but it took some effort too, and it's, oops, I was caught in the story, oops. And there's a shift that recognizes, where one recognizes oneself as the source of the story. And so the story, like a dream, when you wake up from a dream, you know the dream was a dream, but it was still of you. The characters were of you, even if they were
Yeah.
scary or unfamiliar. They were of your substance. And so in that, it's very interesting. And we as human beings love stories. We communicate by stories. We pass on our teachings by stories. So stories are deeply valuable to us. And until we are willing to disengage, briefly at least, from the story, we are actually tyrannized by the stories. And that's the problem. And that's the shift. If we can recognize the story as just this, as a novel. I love reading a good novel or going to a good movie. I love it, and I get totally identified with the characters, and I learn deeply from that. And then the novel's over. Maybe I read it again, or movie's over. And I still am I, but enriched by the story, not tyrannized by the story.
That's a good distinction. So, I was reading about your meeting, first time you meet Papaji, and you said that shortly after that your mind stopped, and that was a breakthrough. And I think he said to you, first thing he said to you was, you've come for the right place to find freedom, to find truth. Then he said to you, do nothing. And you didn't understand that to start with.
Yes.
Can you just talk me through that process?
Well, I was so thrilled to see him. So that was really the context, because I really did recognize this is the one I've been praying for without knowing it would be an Indian man, a guru. In fact, that was sort of the opposite of what I thought it would be. I didn't expect to find myself in this place, and yet it was so perfect and it was so true that I really listened to him very carefully. I knew I was in the right place. And so immediately on meeting him, I got a yes within myself. This is correct. And so I wasn't spending my time doubting him, checking him out, which is natural to do with teachers, and I advise it. But that happened very quickly for me. And so I was paying very close attention. And he said, just stop, just do nothing. And I thought I understood what that meant, but I interpreted it the way I understood stop, do nothing. So I was very still, do nothing, but that was actually doing something. I was actually holding myself in a rigid way, and I was stopping, and he was saying, no, deeper, no, really stop. And I finally let this sink in. It was a profound relaxation. It was an opening. In that way, stop means to open. Just open. Don't reach for anything. Don't reject anything. Just let your mind open. And I don't know when that had happened. All my life, I'd either been rejecting and running from things, or reaching for things, grasping, running toward things. And there was just this spaciousness and light and clarity and stillness. There was no thought. I didn't know that was possible. I would have argued that it was impossible, because when I would think back, all I could see were thoughts. But there are actually many moments in every person's life where there's no thought. Only our whole culture references our lives by thought, so we link up thought to thought to thought. In that moment, he basically said, stop thinking. But he didn't say, stop thinking. It was like, stop thinking. It was an invitation, and it was so easy. It was so natural. And it was deep rest. And from that, then, I could recognize I am. And there's no story of me. In that moment, maybe I didn't even know my name or where I was. It just life. I am. Consciousness. And it cuts something. It cuts a referencing to who I am by whatever story is appearing in me, in being. So it was a huge moment. It wasn't the final moment for me of really realizing, but it was a moment of the dialogue stopping, so that I actually could turn my attention to deeper discovery, rather than just this loop of discussion. What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? Am I getting it? Is this stopping? That just was non-existent.
So what does that mean, turning the attention to deeper discovery? On a practical level, what did that mean for you?
Well, what it meant for me was actually there was a huge fear there. If I didn't have this story, there was
It's like a
first.
void.
First,
Yeah,
there was this
yeah,
moment of
yeah.
exquisite grace, and then there was this, oh, and the thought arose, what now? What to do now? But if I didn't follow that thought, which is what he was advising, if it arises, just don't follow it. Let it sink back down to where it came from. And you could just see the thought just dissolve back into consciousness. And so I could investigate then, open, sort of like what we were speaking about earlier, when I had the nervous attacks as a child and my body disappeared. I could just investigate this as energy without evaluating it or judging it. And then it was just the same light, same consciousness. And this went on for this whole meeting with him, but then I would go back to my little hotel room, or Eli and I would go have lunch or something, and my mind would kick back in, and I would start the same loop of, am I getting it? Is this it? Did I do it right? Am I enlightened yet? But then I would get back in his presence, and he would just say, stop. And he was emanating that, too. So it would be this grace of peace and fulfillment with nothing being done. And then there was just a moment where that was recognized. That's always here, actually. That I felt he gave it to me, but that's not actually the truth, because he was so established in that it was the emanation from his being. And so there was permission for me just to stop telling my story, stop defining myself. And in that, I could just be myself.
It takes a lot of courage, though, to stop telling your story.
I was ready for it, I really had felt, I had told so many different versions of my story, and I had created my reality, and I had attracted prosperity, and I had visualized happiness, and I had a very good life, I had to say. But there was still something fundamental that was dissatisfied. And so I really prayed for a teacher, and a true teacher, a final teacher. And I had had enough failures and enough successes to know that it wasn't in what I did, or at least I didn't know what to do. So I was ready to pay attention, and maybe for me the courage was just going to him, just knocking on his door. After that, I couldn't say it was courage, Ian, really. It was actually easeful. So who knows what steps we have to take, or hurdles we have to leap to get to a certain point, and then it's surrender. And there may be things that come up. I mean, some of my Christian conditioning came up, and, some just nervous agitation came up, but it was just part of what was coming up. It didn't have to be judged. I believe the courage factor is there only when we're really judging that this could lead to something horrible, or this could overtake me, or, oh my God, this shouldn't be happening. If we aren't having that dialogue, it's very natural just to experience what's here, and to, in that, experience what's deeper. So I didn't feel courageous, I have to say.
Okay. It's interesting when new reference points, when old reference points disappear, because I find for myself that it's almost like, it's like a nurturing. Okay, it's this you're I know you used the word void at one point, not today, but I've read it in one of your books about the void and silence you use, not having the story. And for me, I'm aware of a completely different reference point. And I can feel it, beginning of feeling it now. What we can say is, I call it ground of being. But it's fragile. And itself, it's not. I understand it's incredibly strong because it's a tangible substance in a way.
That's right.
But in another way, it's very covered. And it's like, the covering has been there a long time and it's very strong. And there has to be, it's almost as if I have, it's not that I have a choice of where to put my attention, it's I have a choice of where to be aware I don't have to keep my attention somewhere.
That's beautifully said.
And then it can come back.
That's right.
And my attention is grounded in being.
That's right.
But it's a real in and out process. It's
Yes.
it goes on for a long time.
It's a tidal wave of conditioning. I mean, it's before this body. It's the way we've been conditioning to live as human beings, to survive. That's why I really feel that this time of awakening is really important, because we have such huge support from so many people who are experiencing this and are saying, yes, you actually can choose in that moment to surrender, to open, to return to the ground of yourself, to the being of yourself. And that grows. And I see that in meetings. Whereas 20 years ago, it was much more of a struggle just to invite people to investigate. Is there a ground of being? Is there a place of peace and fulfillment within you? And I mean, there would be long conversations, and then maybe finally somebody would, oh, it's here. But now it's much faster, because there are more and more people who are saying, yes, this is the ground of being. And if a story comes up 1,000,000 times a day, so what? That's not the point, as long as that story becomes the signal, what's still here? What's always here? What's the truth of myself? Then the story is not the enemy, or the fear is not the enemy. It's an ally. It's a signal to look deeper.
I know you've talked before about it's the time of the ordinary awakening, whereas before it was what we were led to believe anyway. You had to go away in a cave, or you had to be with a master for 30 years or something, and then move on to another master. Now it's the man in the street, woman in the street can awaken, and that's quite a thought, isn't it? It's quite an idea. It's a very fundamental idea.
It's extraordinary. It says, last night I was mentioning it's like a code has been broken, and something that has held us imprisoned in our own thoughts or others' thoughts has been broken, and there's an openness that's possible. Maybe it's evolutionary. I don't really know, but I know that I mean, we could use the metaphor of how long it used to take to get from London to the States, And now how long does it take? It's like that. It's you don't have to go the old way. There is what's possible, immediate awakening, and then you see what's needed after that, but you know the way home, and you know it's right here. And then the rest is really your choices, what you want, what you love, and what you choose to be true to.
You just mentioned the word prison, and that reminds me that you were actually in prison, weren't you, for 10 days?
I would say jail. I think prison is a heavier thing. Yeah, it was part of an anti-nuclear protest.
Yeah, but it's still pretty scary. You were behind bars.
It was very educational.
Yeah.
Mainly because of we were also in a prison. We were jailed in a prison. We knew we were getting out within 2 weeks, so it was like a play in a way.
It was a story.
Yeah, it was a story.
Yeah.
It was like a role play, but we were there with other women who were actually in prison, and they had mixed emotions about us, of course, middle class women coming in, but there was a connection there. I saw there these women there who made bad mistakes, or maybe had no choice, and there was something that was awakened in me in recognizing that I could be there. Any of us could be there. That we don't have to let those bars separate us. And something started there that has been fulfilled in the prison work of the Gangaji Foundation and Kenny Johnson and John Sherman, who you've been in contact with.
Yeah, I was going to ask you more about your prison work. That really interests me, and I found out because I was in email contact with John Sherman. We haven't talked, and of course he was in prison for many years, and he had quite an extraordinary experience when you were going to a meeting in the prison, and he wasn't even at the meeting. On the way to the meeting, and something happened to him. So tell us a bit about how the prison work is for you.
It's extraordinary. And it was scary going into an all-men's prison the first time I went into it, just because of the deep conditioning. I mean, you go into a door and it slams closed, and first of all, you give up all your possessions and your IDs, and you go into another door and it slams closed, and then you go into, or I went into, a very overcrowded prison, and people are looking at you, and then finally we made our way back to a little chapel, and out of a prison of maybe 3,000 inmates, it should have been maybe 1,500, but there were 3,000, 20 or 30 were in this little chapel. So it's that percentage of the prison population, and it was profound and beautiful. These were men who had made horrible choices in their lives, who had failed and knew it. And in that there was a kind of facing death. They were living a death. Their lives had ended. Their stories had not turned out the way they had planned, and they realized that, and realized that there was possibly something that could serve, and so there was a readiness and an attention and an appreciation for someone coming in to not exclude them and to recognize them as the same self. So I deeply benefited from it, and I was having a series of meetings in Boulder, Colorado, which was near this particular prison where John was, and I went back and told the people I was meeting with, and they were like thrilled. There was a kind of connection then that was made between inside and outside, between these, what we would have thought of as hardened, scary guys, and these sort of pampered free spirits. There was a connection made that we're the same self, and we want the same thing. And that's to be free. To be free whether we're in prison or to be free whether we're living outside the prison. And so it's fed each other. I'd say both prisoners and non-prisoners benefit from that connection. I know I have.
Well, we live in a kind of a different kind of prison outside until we wake up.
That's right, exactly.
You know, I met Bo Lozoff once, and if you know Bo Lozoff,
yes,
he of course is very active in working in prisons in America. And I read his first book, We're All Doing Time.
Yeah.
It's such a moving book. This is basically, as you would know, exchange of letters between him and prisoners. And some of these prisoners are really they are mass murderers. They've done terrible things. And they have been in prison a long time, will be there all their life. And the letters, as they start to open up, is just so moving.
It's
just so extraordinary.
Yes.
And I suppose being in a real prison, as opposed to our own mind prison, you're in a double prison, aren't you? You've got your mind in prison, and you're physically imprisoned. Right. And you've got no option but to look here.
That's right. Your choices are very limited, and so your choices become inner choices. And the ones who take those inner choices go very deep, as you know from that book and letters and people I've met. And now Kenny Johnson, someone who was at those early meetings, has formed his own prison program and goes into prisons and speaks with juveniles. And he was somebody who had been in and out of prison since he was, I think, 15 years old. He was, a hardened guy, and he opened up. And the news for us is that we have no excuse,
Yes.
And that's very good news, because we tend to make excuses, to postpone things, I'm not good enough, or I don't meditate enough, or I still have negative thoughts. And we use that to keep ourselves in prison, rather than just opening up to what is innocent and pure and free right now.
I think the interesting thing is now these days too, that deep openings are happening to people that have done nothing before in their life.
Yes.
And they're coming in they're not coming in a subtle way, they're coming in such a dramatic way that they have to look, because either they have to look or they end up in the mental hospital, one or the other. There's no halfway house with them. And I guess that's again an extension of what we were talking about earlier, is about the ordinary awakening is here. And it's coming, and somehow consciousness is just wham, it's random, isn't it?
Yes, it seems random to me. We could call it grace or luck, but it's definitely beyond any notion of practice or karma or good or bad. It's a spark that has spread. It's a prairie fire.
So my process with you is interesting because I haven't really looked at my notes. I have a few questions, and I'm just waiting for the next question to arise, and one hasn't arisen this time, so I have to tell you that. So as I haven't got
That's
a question
nice.
at the moment, I'm looking at the clock. We've got about 8 minutes left, so we're not there yet. I realise it's powerful looking at you, and I can hear there's a train somewhere in the background, and I'm realising it's also a television programme, so it'll be good to get something to move it into something that we can talk about.
I remember when that has happened on radio sometimes, where there's been a moment of silence, and at first the interviewer on the radio show said, "Oh, we're not allowed to have any dead space," and so then we actually discussed, was that dead space, or was it a live space? And it was actually a very full space. So, maybe on television, how extraordinary and revolutionary to have moments of nothing happening but life.
I know you do. I just sneaked a little look at my notes there. It says this is actually it's good to bring this up now because you had at one point a desperation to escape the void.
Did I say that?
Empty of desperation to escape the void, empty of hope and life and spirit that I secretly feared was my true face. But anyway, it doesn't matter.
Oh, I can relate to it,
Yeah.
I don't remember writing that, but because I'd had many moments, actually, of just feeling that if I looked inward, it was really bad news. That I could have a facade of happiness, I knew how to look right and be friendly, but if I was by myself, alone, and really exposed myself to myself, I sensed this murky, maybe abyss is not the right word, but just this area of lostness and damage, like a wound. People speak of their wounds, and this felt like an essential wound. This felt like a soul wound, like something was deeply wrong with me, and it, of course, like most people, I thought it was just me, that everybody else was basically healthy, and if they looked inward, they would find the light. But when I looked inward, I found what was dark, and so maybe that's where the moment of courage really came, just a willingness to go all the way into that, because it felt like it was endless, and it felt like, no, this is really the truth of myself, and so it was a willingness, well, if this is the truth of myself, then I want to know that. And to go all the way into that. And then what that is really is consciousness has somehow separated, and there's this object of darkness and unknowability, and consciousness remerges with that, and in a sense shines a light into that. And it was less than a second then. It was open and free. Whereas most of my life it had been there as something to haunt me. I didn't often go into it. In fact, maybe that's what precipitated those early experiences of being 6 years old and trying to avoid that, and so leaving my body in a certain sense. But the willingness to, and maybe willingness is too strong a word, not exactly willing, but nevertheless meeting it and discovering that meeting itself is a kind of communion and an integration with all aspects of myself. And that darkness then is not there. It was an illusion, but it was a wound illusion, but it was not a real wound.
Yeah.
It only was real when I wasn't looking at it, and only had power when I wasn't willing to go into the core of it. And of course I had a story to support it. I had proof of why I was wounded and the results of that wounding. But when I actually met it as an energy, it was liberated,
No, I
was
understand,
released.
yeah.
Huh.
Do you think people need a teacher still? When you were saying about when you met Papaji, you were praying to meet a teacher, and you were so happy to meet him, and that was so fundamental for you. Do you think that's still the case for people?
I don't know, really. I know it was for me. And I know that there are plenty of teachers who say it's not necessary. So I would say for some people it must not be necessary. And for some people it's necessary. I don't even know how one would know. If you wake up on your own, you don't need a teacher. And if you're able to be true to that, I needed a teacher.
Yes.
And
but isn't also, I think, my own experiences are that this integration is so important. Something,
yes.
an experience happens that comes out of the blue, throws me, and I can either dismiss it, which I can only do on a temporary basis, or I can try and understand it to a degree, and then there's somehow an integration. It isn't necessarily me integrating, it's an integration, something happens into my humanness, and something changes in my life.
That's right.
And so the experience is always the boss, if you like, in terms of that level. But it's that process, and I guess the teaching or teacher is very helpful in that integration.
Well, for me it was essential because there was a way I was sort of doing that integration, or I was processing things, and especially my teacher said, stop, stop all that doing. Just stop, just be as you are. And that my teacher is still alive in me. I'd say he's still my teacher. And he was an extraordinary teacher. He did not teach a creed, and he didn't teach a practice, and he was a free being. So I feel blessed to have had a real teacher in that I didn't have to be a certain way or do things. And we could disagree. We definitely disagreed politically and in other ways, but I needed him because with him I started to play out my normal roles, even from these profound experiences. I fell in love with my teacher, so first he was my daddy, and I was trying to be the good little girl, and he wasn't interested. And then I'll be this beautiful, princess in his court, and he wasn't interested. Every act of my life came up to sort of be played against him, to be bounced against him, and he just wasn't interested. And then I was just myself with him, and he would, So the relationship itself was necessary for me, but maybe because I'd always been able to be somehow in control of relationships, and I wasn't in control here. I had to surrender.
And he wouldn't support your story
He just
at any
wouldn't
level
support
at all.
it at any level.
No, yeah.
He was actually disgusted by it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was like, whoa. And that was very useful for me because there was a regression that happened. I regressed. I became actually very awkward around him, and maybe like a 9 or a 10-year-old, and saying inappropriate things. And it was just something that had to play itself out. But I wasn't doing it, and I wasn't processing it. Sometimes I was appalled at how clumsy I was or stupid I was, but it was all just held in this somehow. I didn't spend that much time with him either. It was 6 weeks the first time, and a couple of weeks for the next 5 years, and then I didn't see him anymore. I knew I didn't need to see him, but he was still my teacher. He's still my teacher, and it's just a holy relationship for me, and maybe it isn't kind of old-fashioned relationship. It's like maybe people don't need to have husbands and wives or parents, or maybe all of that will be outdated. But for me, it was essential, and I really honor it.
Gangaji, thank you very much for coming along. I've got a lot from this.
Thank you. Me too.
Thank you. And of course, you have some books out, many books out actually. Here, 2 of them, which are currently available. There's one just like you, which is a biography, which I found very, very, very interesting. And You Are That, which is a book, transcriptions from satsangs. And there's also what I've been listening to in the car, is The Diamond in Your Pocket, which is great too. Thank you, and thank you for watching Conscious TV. Goodbye.